So, welcome to the part 3 of our WPF piano series. Up till now, we have finished creating the sort of prototype user interface of the keyboard. Now, we wanted to actually play some sound through a keyboard or a synthesizer. At this stage, what I'm going to do is create a side project within this main solution, which will first hook this software into a MIDI keyboard with a MIDI keyboard using the NAudio library, so that we can see the basics of how to connect with a MIDI keyboard. Now, in this particular case, what we are trying to do is that when we press a key on our keyboard user control, it should play a particular note on the synthesizer or the musical keyboard. So we are going to first digress and create a small project which will just work out the basics of integrating a keyboard using MIDI. And when I say a keyboard, I mean actual musical keyboard or synthesizer using MIDI to our computer. So I think this is where we left off last time. So I'm going to create a new project here, and going to make it a console Windows. So I'm going to call it MIDI test, and we're going to use NuGet to get the NAudio library. The NAudio library is probably the best audio library for .NET applications as far as I know. So NAudio has a built-in module for MIDI interfacing, which we're going to use here. Okay, so I'm going to close these windows, and so we'll just use the program file to quickly get some test code running to make sure that we have a MIDI keyboard connected and we can interface with it. We're going to use NAudio.MIDI interface. So first step in working with a MIDI keyboard is that we need to get a list of all the MIDI devices connected into the system. What will happen is we're going to use the USB port of the computer to connect to a MIDI keyboard. So we'll write a function to list out all the MIDI devices which are connected to this computer. So let's create a function called list devices. So there are two kinds of devices. One is MIDI in and MIDI out. So as the name suggests, MIDI in devices are the devices which send MIDI messages into the system, and MIDI out is what the computer sends out back onto the MIDI device. So NAudio has two built-in objects called MIDI in and MIDI out. So let's just see int I is equal to 0, I is equal to MIDI in number of devices, and we will just print it out on the console, right line, MIDI in, device info, and we take in the index and stick it the product name, and we do the same for the out devices. Why is there less indent here? So this will be MIDI out, and going to call this function from the main. Let's see if it runs. Oh, sorry, change this to the starter project. Always comes up. Yeah, the two lists have kind of got mixed up. Let me just put some console write line. And these are the MIDI out devices. Could you put some spacing? So let's see what we have. So we have one MIDI in device, which is the keyboard which I've connected to this, and we have three MIDI out devices. Now the first one, Microsoft GS Wavetable Synth, is a default virtual MIDI device which is built into Windows. So we won't be using that. We'll be using this USB 2.0 MIDI, which is the MIDI signature which this particular keyboard. This is an old Yamaha PSR 260 something. This is what its MIDI signature is. Now that we have a list of the devices, the next step would be to capture the MIDI signals which are going to come in from the keyboard. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to press keys on the MIDI keyboard, and those are going to generate MIDI messages. So those MIDI messages are going to be captured in the MIDI in interface. Let me just indent this. So we need, wait a minute, where is this coming from? Alright, this will go here, this will go here. We'll create a new method called handle MIDI messages. First we need to know that we have an existing MIDI device. So we create an object called static MIDI in is equal to null. In this loop where we're polling for MIDI in devices, if it finds even one, that means we have a MIDI keyboard or a MIDI device connected. So we'll need the static int MIDI in index is equal to -1. So we're going to store the index of which MIDI in device we're going to deal with. MIDI index is equal to, we take the first device, so yeah. If this loop runs, then MIDI in index will become 0, which will change for -1. So here it means if there is any existing MIDI index which is more than 1, then we can go ahead and handle MIDI messages static. This is so we take our MIDI in is equal to new MIDI in this takes in the index device number. So this is our MIDI in index, and then we go to track two event handlers. One is message received and the other is error received. So MIDI in message received plus is equal to, this is 1, and the same thing for error received. We'll just dump the event messages. Console write line E. We need the timestamp. MIDI event, which is name of the event, and the raw message. Yeah. The same thing for the message received. If it finds a MIDI device, it will start handling MIDI messages, and it will go on handling this in an infinite loop. So we need to tell it way to stop. So since this is a console application, we don't have any fancy keyboard or mouse handling. Just going to keep a console read line key. So if I press enter, this thing will stop, which means I will stop it and I will dispose of it. Okay, let's see it work now. Press run. So it's not getting any messages because I put the keyboard off. I'm going to turn it on. I've put it on. Let me start the program again. Are we doing the right thing? And MIDI messages. Let me check. It's going here. Oh yes, I forgot to start the device. So where this needs to start. I think it should be fine now. Yes, so there are some automatic MIDI messages which are sent between the computer and the keyboard. I'm going to press some keys now. Yeah, so it's detecting the keys. I'm going to stop checking this. The next thing which we're going to try is to send a MIDI out message so that we can make the keyboard play a note by sending a MIDI message from here. So let's create another index for out devices. So in the list of out devices, we want to ignore the first one because that's the default one. So we're going to start with 1 instead of 0. MIDI out devices. Zero, then just put as MIDI out index. So it finds at least 2 MIDI out devices, then we take the first one in the list. So we're going to comment these out, this particular function out, and we're going to call a function called play note. And we won't be needing these 2 lines either because we're not working with the MIDI in device anymore. So play note will go here. So we're going to take the MIDI out device. Will be MIDI out index. We will send a MIDI message start note, 60, volume, let's make it 127, channel 1. Start note, raw data, dump something to the console which shows that it was sent, and then we need to stop the note. Let's just sleep for a while, sleep for 1000 milliseconds. We send a stop message, stop note. Again we put a message out. Let's change this. Okay. So play note. This keeps coming up. Now when I run the program, it should play a single note, which again is syntax error here. Good. Play a different frequency, higher frequency, and stop that frequency. That was too high. Maybe 30. Yeah. So now we've been able to test both the MIDI in messages and the MIDI out messages. So we have worked out the MIDI interface to the computer. Now we are going to go back to the keyboard user control in the next video and see how to add this MIDI code into that user control so that we can sync the virtual keyboard with the actual keyboard.